When working either in the exchange or on customer premises, we need to check we're working in a safe environment, especially when working in lofts or confined spaces. That means we need to carefully follow the guidelines for working in confined spaces, as well as the more obvious dangers such as falls or items falling. Collisions like banging your head. We also need to consider the structure where we're working, and hazards such as electrical shocks or biological hazards. Okay Andy, what's next?
Well, with any task you must be confident in your own abilities, and you can prove that by carrying out a thorough risk assessment. One thing that we're going to try and avoid is working aloft if at all possible, but if we've established that we have to work either in a loft space or a loft, then we've got to make sure that we choose the correct access equipment. Now that could be steps or it could be a ladder, and if it's 1.7 metres or more above the ground, it will definitely be a ladder that's required.
Right.
As with all work activity, your main protection against injury is your personal on-site risk assessment. It is particularly important to take the time to think through all the hazards encountered in each loft before you decide to use it to distribute cables and services. If your assessment tells you the loft is unsafe and no alternative appears to be available, explain the situation to the customer and follow the normal escalation process. The task you have to undertake will determine what access equipment you will need. Will you need to remove or lift large, heavy tools or fittings? You need to look at the structure. Will it take your weight? Will it support the ladders? Is the area accessed from within the building or outdoors? Will the light or the weather conditions affect your safety? What are the ground conditions like? Is it level? Will you need packing pieces? Is it firm or soft? And finally, what are the local hazards like traffic, pedestrians or overhead power cables? Do you need guarding, signs or additional information about the site? And you need to consider what is the best access equipment. Will step ladders do? Will you need ladders or scaffolding? Can the task be done from power lifts or platform elevating equipment? If in any doubt and there is no alternative, ask your manager or coach for assistance. And this will probably lead to a local risk assessment by your manager. What is most important is never use improvised access. Don't climb on something to reach. Things like pallets or chairs or tables, none of these have been made to take the weight of someone climbing on them, and you can easily have a very nasty accident if you fall. And only use BT approved equipment. Ideally you should avoid using non-company access systems, but in some cases it can be unavoidable and even preferable. Never use customer systems without asking permission, but even then check it thoroughly. In commercial premises they should have maintenance and inspection records you could ask to see. Any specialist systems such as towers, scaffolding and lifts should only be used or erected by trained people. If in any doubt, you should check with your manager first. Any non-company access equipment must be thoroughly checked, and if in doubt, don't use it, especially domestic steps or loft ladders. They will probably be poorly maintained. Ask the customer to deploy loft ladders and demonstrate their use and check their stability.
So what about PPE?
Well, suitable protective footwear is mandatory, but make sure that it's clean and dry and be considerate of the customer's carpets.
And obviously the hard hat's mandatory, and make sure you always put on your chin strap.
Yeah, that's correct. And always wear a helmet where there is restricted headroom or working at heights above 2 metres. And it's always preferable to wear PVC or leather gloves, and they must be worn if you have rings on your fingers, although you can tape these to prevent snagging. If you're going to be working looking up, or if there is a risk from dislodged particles or debris, you must wear eye shields 3A or 5, or eye shields over glasses, or a face screen. And in some cases you may need to wear a face mask, especially where it is very dirty and dusty.
Okay Andy, we've come to a customer's house. What kind of things should we consider here?
Ask the customer if they've got a loft ladder, and if they have, ask them to deploy it, show you how it operates, but you must give it a full inspection before using it. Now in this particular instance, the customer hasn't got a loft ladder, and we're going to make use of Steps Combination 5-tread.
Oh, right. Looks pretty dark up there.
Yeah, that's another question that you need to ask the customer. You know, is there permanent lighting in the loft? Well, in this instance, they've said yes, there is. There's one light bulb up there, and that might not be enough to illuminate everything that we need to see. So I've put the helmet light on,
Right.
and that should give me sufficient light.
Okay.
When you get to a point on the ladder where you can actually see into the loft space, have a good look round. See if there are any obvious hazards up here. Check to see whether there are any defects in the structure that are obvious.
Right.
And one thing you must check for is the presence of boarding in the loft. If there isn't any boarding up here, then you're going to have to report it to your line manager and seek advice.
Right.
And it may be that a local risk assessment has to be carried out.
Okay.
Even if the boarding is up here, don't stand on any loose ends. It could snap off and you then put your foot through the ceiling.
Okay.
The other thing to watch out for is loft insulation. Don't step on any loft insulation until you've checked what's actually underneath it. Something that is worth mentioning at this point is fragile surfaces, as lofts without proper boarding should be considered to be a fragile surface. That is, any material that is not designed to support a load and is suspended above a void. Examples include glass or plastic skylights, asbestos cement or corrugated iron roofs, and in this case plasterboard. Well, this loft looks okay, so I'm actually going to go in there now.
Okay.
And if you'd like to follow me, and we'll have a chat through one or two items that are up here.
Okay, what other things are we looking for?
Well, just behind you, you can see that there are pipes, probably about, 100 millimetres above the boarding. An excellent example of a trip hazard. Now they could be anywhere in the loft space, you know, just watch out for them as you're moving around. We've got power cables just simply laid on the boarding. Some of them are, you know, stapled to a joist there, but they could be damaged. Don't touch them. And then you've got biological hazards which could be present in a loft. You know, things like vermin. Could be birds that are nesting up here, could be wasps. And things like wasps, they don't need an awful lot of antagonisation before they'll come and attack you.
Okay. Okay, and the joists? Checking the joists as well?
Well, the joists themselves appear to be perfectly sound. I have looked around already, you know, to check, but as you're moving along the loft space, it's always worth double checking. If you see something that you don't like the look of, then, you know, stop the work there and then and have a word with the customer about it.
And hence the hard hat as well, to stop you
well, the hard hat
your head.
Is obviously needed in here because we've not got an awful lot of headroom. Another thing that you can be looking around for is any clutter that might be in the loft. And if there are any heavy objects up here and they're actually in the way of the work that we're performing, then we're supposed to ask the customer to actually move them. Now if they can't be moved, then we're going to have to try and think about an alternative route for the cable. And if that's not possible, then we're going to have to refer it back to our manager, and again a local risk assessment will have to be performed.
Okay. Would you class this as a confined space?
Well, domestic lofts are usually quite good as far as ventilation is concerned, and you wouldn't class it as a confined space. The risk of asphyxiation up here is very, very low indeed. Hot weather though can be a bit of a problem. If you're working up here for long periods in hot weather, you know, you might start to feel a little bit faint. Well, if you do, then get yourself down and cool down. Another thing to look out for is, particularly in older properties, you know, the timber up here may have been treated, you know, for things like woodworm, for things like dry rot. Now some of the chemicals can be an irritant, and if you suspect that those chemicals are present, now that could be, you know, a strange odour, then get out of the loft, have a word with the customer and report it to your manager. And it could be that a risk assessment has got to be performed before any further work takes place in that loft space.
Okay. What about storage of, I don't know, chemicals or anything?
Yeah, some people do actually use the space in the lofts to store, you know, bottles of chemical or, you know, cans of chemicals, stuff that they don't use an awful lot. And it could be that, you know, deterioration of the container has set in, so there could be chemical leakage up here. Again, if there's anything obvious like that, don't do any further work,
Yeah.
have a word with the customer and report it to your manager.
Okay.
Right, in older properties, as you're looking round, have a look to see if there's any asbestos present.
Asbestos?
Yeah, it was used quite a lot as an insulating material and also building material in older houses. And if there is any suspicion at all that material that you found in the loft is asbestos, get out of the loft, report it to the customer and also report it to your line manager.
Okay.
Most commercial premises will know about any asbestos hazard and they should inform you. If they don't, ask to see their asbestos management plan, which should highlight any risks. But many householders may not know it exists, so you should always check before you start. Houses that are older than 10 or 15 years may have asbestos insulation, panelling or even asbestos cement and Artex, so be particularly vigilant when working in older houses.
You mentioned commercial loft spaces there. How do these differ from where we are at the moment in a domestic loft?
Well, they can be very different, often much bigger and with defined cable access points, walkways and cable runways. Some will have hazards that are specific to that situation. Therefore, you should always assess each and every location carefully and if in doubt, seek advice. And as this is entry into a cable loft, that is restricted to authorised personnel only. And you must inform your control that you're going in and more importantly, let them know when you've come out.
Okay.
Always climb the ladder with both hands on the rungs, and if any equipment needs to be taken into the loft, then tie a sash line to it, and when you get to a safe position in the loft, haul the equipment up using the sash line. And don't forget, never use the loft space as a storage area.
Okay, Andy, do we need to do a gas test up here?
Well, the risk assessment that we've carried out seems to indicate not, because we've got ventilation at both ends of the building.
Right.
So I'm quite happy that we can work in here without carrying out a gas test.
Okay, well, here we are in the loft. How does this differ from a commercial loft?
Well, for those people who are not familiar, this is a typical BT exchange loft. And there are a few key features that BT put in as standard. Number one, we've got lighting down the side of the roof space here. Now that might be okay for just general work taking place, but if it's more detailed work in one of the darker corners, then torches or headlights, should also be brought up with you.
So what should we be aware of up here?
Right, two things. Walkways, always stick to the walkways.
Yeah.
Now there's the main walkway which you can see running right down the axis of the building, and then branching out from that there are the smaller ones. And whenever you're moving around up here, always stay on the walkways.
Yeah, okay.
Going onto joists, going onto metalwork, you always risk, slipping and putting a foot through the ceiling, because the ceiling in here is only made of plasterboard.
Okay, so there's a lot of cables and stuff.
Any cable has got to be laid on the cable trays, because
Yeah.
you don't want the weight of the cable pressing on the ceiling itself. When it comes off the cable tray, it's going down through the ceiling material, and then you've got to seal around the cables with fire stopping material. Now that is mandatory, and any procedures that are laid down as far as the materials are concerned and the practice must be followed to the letter.
Right, okay. What if we're on commercial premises?
Well, if any cables have to go through the ceiling material, then any fire stopping material would have to be replaced. If it isn't there, then you must inform the customer, because it is a fire hazard with that material missing. Working in false ceilings can be deceptively dangerous, because you get the impression that you're not very high, when in fact you could be a couple of metres high. They also will not take any weight. So if you try to stabilise yourself by leaning on them, you could end up by falling and bringing down the entire ceiling.
It can be pretty dusty too.
When you remove tiles, you nearly always get a face full of dust and debris. This is unpleasant even if you're wearing your eye shields. But there is a far greater danger, as some older false ceilings can hide or contain asbestos. So you need to check very carefully before you disturb any tiles.
I suppose the best way of dealing with these is to avoid running cables through them at all.
False ceilings were never designed to have cabling run across them, and so they do not have proper cable trays to carry the wiring. Now this results in cables laying across sharp metal edges and even light fittings. If there is no other option but to run wires within a false ceiling, then cables should only be run round the edges of the room and ideally secured to a wall, so that their weight is not putting a load on the false ceiling.
To recap, make sure you do a thorough risk assessment. Determine which is the most appropriate access equipment to use. Never use improvised access. Check customers' access equipment before you use it. Make sure you have the correct PPE. Make sure you have sufficient light. Check the structure and look for defects and ask about any known hazards. Look out for and avoid electrical wiring. Check for biological hazards, especially asbestos. Be especially careful when working above a false ceiling, or if possible, find an alternative route as you can't be sure what hazards exist. Always replace any fire-stopping materials and inform the appropriate person if it is missing. Working in confined spaces, always ensure a thorough local risk assessment has been made.